Hey everybody, welcome to the PC Perspective Mailbag. I'm Ryan Shrout, and it is March 15th as we record this. March Madness is underway. This is probably my most exciting weekend of the year, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, all college basketball. So root on your favorite team, and if you don't have one, root for my team, which is Kentucky. As always, this is a question-answer show. We depend on your questions for content, so if you could leave them for us, either in the YouTube comments to this video or on the PCPer page that includes this video in it, then we'll sort through them, look through them, and try to answer as many or some as we can. A little bit short on questions this week, so it might be a little bit shorter episode, but we'll see how long I can ramble on about some of them. So let's get started. Woot Doctor wants to know, how do you feel about gaming chairs with an integrated rumble function? Do they offer realistic and useful gaming and driving feedback? Are they worthwhile? Would you prefer to have a rumble chair or a weekend in Bangkok? Well, this last question is easiest. I'd rather have a weekend vacation in most places rather than a rumble chair. I'll be honest, I haven't used these, at least not in several years, and I would equate them to force feedback controllers for console games, or for if you use those on a PC. In other words, I would say they are tepidly interesting, but probably not that useful for driving feedback. You know, I don't know what a rumbling seat tells me about when I'm driving, other than I'm going over some rough roads. Now, if you want to get into the idea of having a full motion seat with, pistons and stuff that are moving your seat forward, backwards, left, and right a certain number of degrees as you're turning, that might be more worthwhile, and really maybe gets into that cost of a weekend in Bangkok type of discussion as well. So I like the idea of these simulator chairs. I do not think an integrated rumble function that shakes my butt and lower, and upper thighs is really that useful for me for any kind of gaming experience, if you will. Maybe a little TMI for you there. Richard Byrne wants to know, what traits should I look for when buying a virtual machine host SSD? I'm looking to upgrade my Unraid cache storage, which is currently a RAID 1 of two 500 gigabyte 850 EVOs, hosting some Docker containers and about 10 VMs for game servers. Am I likely to see a performance improvement if I were to move to, say, the 960 EVOs? This is an interesting question, right? And it really depends on how heavy the usage is on these VMs. If they're mostly idle, you probably won't see significant improvement. But if you've got those 10 game servers and you kind of regularly have people gaming on them, and if it's not just you and your friends moving from one to the other, then you actually would see some improvement, I think, going to NVMe drives. Another option, well, no, you're talking about putting these... Well, if you have a full PC and you really want to spend some dough, you could get a 900p, right? An Optane 900p, and there you have tremendous random read performance capabilities. It would be great if those VMs are all kind of working at the same time, working simultaneously, where the random read capabilities of those devices would be stressed pretty dramatically. You have one of the environments that I think makes more sense for this type of environment than anything else. Now, would I go as far as to get two of those and put them in a RAID? One array, a mirrored array? Probably not, especially if it's just a cache, right? You probably don't have to do that, but I understand why you would. But I still think even a movement up to 960 EVOs, you'd probably see a jump up in performance as well. Again, that is if all of the VMs are kind of active at the same time. Otherwise, I think maybe your net positive is going to be pretty minimal there. Nick Kearney wants to know, what are the ins and outs of using a VM and older version of Windows to play old games like the first two GTA games or Need for Speed games that do not run on Windows 10? I'm thinking specifically about issues with hardware acceleration and modern controllers. This actually would have been a better question for Jim to answer, but I'll offer my 2 cents. I believe that the virtual machine infrastructure has actually gotten pretty good, right? As long as you're not trying to subdivide your GPU into subsections or whatever, like if you have one GPU you want it to power two different VMs, that's not going to work very well. But if you're just passing one GPU through to one system, it actually is a pretty easy thing for it to do at this point. And all the VMs, all the VM hypervisors that we use, VMware, VM Player, whatever it is, have pretty good support for fairly high performance implementation of this hardware. And if we're talking about, older games that maybe require less GPU horsepower, the added overhead of the VM shouldn't have too dramatic of an impact for you. As for the controllers, those should just work, right? You may have to have drivers, but I can't imagine, if you're talking about like Xbox controllers, I don't think that's going to be a problem. If you're looking about other third-party devices, I can't answer that. I honestly don't know how well those kind of pass through and are affected by virtual machine environments. So, but no, I do think that I'll ask Jim if he has any other feedback on this one that maybe we could follow up with next week. But I don't think there's any problem at this point kind of doing the VM to run a Windows 7 iteration so you could play some older titles that didn't add support for Windows 10 in it. Trolling for Dollars wants to know, why are GPUs, the chip on the board, not the whole card itself, not socketed like CPUs? On the surface, it would make sense, right? If you could suddenly change out the GPU on your graphics card, like you change out the CPU on your motherboard, that maybe upgrades or things would be easier to handle, and NVIDIA could release a new generation. You could, swap it in. The problem that comes into play here is the same problem that affects CPUs and motherboards and those chipset platforms, but accelerated and more dynamic or dramatic, I guess I would say. So the reason you switch a motherboard chipset out or motherboard platform out for a new processor is that you have different power configurations than you had before. Either, you could think of when we went from a fully integrated voltage regulator to back away from a fully integrated voltage regulator. The motherboard dynamics had to change there. You might change because of the pinout of your memory system changed. You went from DDR3 to 4, or you shortened some traces that allow you to get 2933 megahertz memory instead of 2400 megahertz memory, right? So there are some things that you can do that you can only do when you change the infrastructure around the chip. And with a graphics processing unit, a GPU, if you will, that's actually even more problematic to deal with, because the amount of power that's going into the chip is it's higher in the most part, especially if we're talking about GTX 1080 Ti scale stuff. So better integration of power management on the board directly to the chip, not passing through a socket, passing through potentially degraded interconnects after, socket opening closings, that type of stuff would be affected there. The memory systems change. It's basically a result of, you're not really just designing that chip when you're NVIDIA. You're designing all the stuff around it as well. You have to take into account the power. You have to take into account the memory system. You take into account the PCIe interconnect, whatever else there happens to be on here. And it just was never thought to be or designed to be as modular as a processor was. And if you kind of think about it, a lot of designs, when they're trying to get a whole bunch of stuff into a pretty compact space, they are integrated CPU designs, right? So think of, all-in-one PCs that don't have socketed motherboards, right? They're soldered on directly. That gives you benefits for power consumption, thermal considerations, all kinds of stuff. Is it possible they could do it? It's possible they could probably do it, but I don't think there's a demand for it, and I think there's serious potential drawbacks if you were to try to design something like that, right? Plus, you have to worry about cooling solutions that you're using, and think of how complicated it is already to figure out if your cooler supports AM4 or if it supports TR4 Threadripper coolers and all that, and everything would change with GPUs as well. Scott Jones wants to know, why do consumers have to buy PCs from OEMs? I hate middlemen, so why use them instead of going straight to the ODMs? It's, in a couple of cases, you're actually doing that, right? So some of these OEMs also are the ODMs, right? Asus, for example, builds some of their machines. Acer builds some of their machines. But, the real reason why ODMs exist and OEMs exist is because ODMs specialize in production and design. They do not specialize in distribution. They don't specialize in support, in pricing, in making arrangements with, partnerships with Intel and AMD and all the other guys that go with picking the components for this. So the ODMs are just specialized at manufacturing, and the OEMs are specialized at picking the right components, having a manufacturer build them at the right spec, selling them, marketing, supporting, all that type of stuff that goes into it, all the other surrounding thing about it. So, there, I don't know if you could still do it. I guess you probably still could, but there was a time where you could go, you'd have to not through Newegg or whatever, but maybe eBay in some locations, you could find some Chenbro built notebooks and stuff like that that you would buy that are completely as is because there's no support structure to go with it. And I don't know how much money you would save, maybe some. But if that's just a thing you want to do, you could probably still do that. But the reason there are middlemen in any business is because, in general, it's because of specialization, and that's most everyone agrees that middleman, whatever you want to call that, is doing something better than other people could do it, right? So why don't OEMs just build all their own stuff? Because they don't want to have to go into the infrastructure and design and manufacturing stuff that the OEMs do, right? So there's just a little bit of separation there. Let's see. JMC asks, a long time ago, NVIDIA demonstrated a soft physics demo with a squishy worm monster coming after you. It was extremely effective and creeping me out, and I was thrilled at the thought of seeing this kind of stuff in my games. What happened? I haven't seen any games using anything like that in the years since. I'm going to be honest with you, JMC. I don't know what the soft physics squishy worm monster demo is from NVIDIA, but I will say this. When NVIDIA makes those demos and their content team creates these things, they're talking to the gamers, they're talking to the end users, trying to showcase here's what our products and GPUs are capable of doing that our competition can't. But they're also very, very strongly talking to the developers, and they're saying, "Hey, developer, look at this cool thing we've done. We're going to give you the capability to do this. Here's some code. Here's some direction. Here's some suggestion," right? And the hope would be that the game developer sees that, finds a cool use for it, integrates it into their game, and boom, you see that out there. A lot of times that just doesn't happen. Sometimes what NVIDIA has to do is they're creating things that maybe aren't that useful, or people have alternative solutions for, or they just need a reason, they need a way to show off the power of their new product. From a game developer standpoint, there's cost involved of like actually integrating it and spending the time to develop and code it or whatever, which is why something like GameWorks exists. And it gets a bad rap, and there's some positives and some negatives to it. But the reason GameWorks exists is because it enables somebody like NVIDIA to create these libraries that make things like hair physics or squishy worm physics to be more easily accessible to the game developer, again, encouraging them to try to get this kind of cool, new, neat stuff into the product. So as for what happened to this specific design, I don't know, but not every one of these demos is utilized. And if it is, it may not be utilized in a way that is familiar, looks similar to what you saw originally, and it may be something completely different. It may be that technology is integrated in the game, and we just don't know it. So, the Blob, I won't read the rest of his name, but the Blob wants to know, when will AM4 motherboard support Raven Ridge full feature set, including the full complement of onboard video output that the APUs support and hardware? Will I have to wait for motherboards with 400 series chipsets? I don't want to build my system until I know that my motherboard offers complete support for all Raven Ridge features. So the full complement of onboard video output that the APUs support and hardware. So I guess I don't really know what the question is. If you have an AM4 motherboard that has video output and you put a Raven Ridge part in it, which is currently the Ryzen 5 2400G and the Ryzen 3 2200G, it will support the display outputs that are connected on that motherboard now. So I don't really know what feature set you think is not included in that, I guess, unless maybe the Blob here is mistaken Raven Ridge for generic Ryzen processors. If it doesn't have the G at the end, if it's not the 2400G or the 2200G, it doesn't have integrated graphics, so it's not going to support any of the display outputs, and those just become essentially dead connectors on current AM4 motherboards. As for the 400 series chipsets, from what we know at this point, I don't think they're going to do anything different regarding display output and connectivity output, so I wouldn't expect any particular changes there. So if you have a follow-up for this one and maybe you want to be more specific about what you're asking for the Blob, I can try to see what we can do. Next question comes from You Shot My Monkey. Asks, your Intel 800P review mentioned how its by 2 PCIe interface PCIe interface limits its performance compared to SSDs that use by4 speeds. Is the opposite true? Why don't we see by8 and by16 PCIe SSDs? Yes, I mean, the opposite would be true. If you had a by8 SSD that, for all of the reasons, could go faster than what the by4 interface is, you would see higher throughput, right? You'd see higher gigabytes per second of read and write speeds sequentially. The complication there is a couple of things. One, M.2 slots, which is where most of these PCIe NVMe SSDs exist today, only goes up to by4 PCIe. If you want to do an add-in card SSD, those are all still by4 SSDs as well. Now, when you get into things like RAID cards, you'll see by8, right? So if you have like a big SAS RAID card that supports 16 drives or whatever, you'll see by8 interface connectivity there for higher throughput. So why is that? A lot of it comes down to kind of cost and integration to design, but also these storage controllers for the PCIe and NVMe SSDs, need to be able to work at the higher speeds, right? So if the controller can't communicate with the flash at a speed fast enough to go beyond by4 PCIe, then there's no reason to make a by8 card. Now, do I imagine we'll see SSDs come out that have more direct channels that can interact with the flash media or Optane media more directly, and thus we can get above by4 PCIe limits? I definitely think we'll get there. There's just not a whole lot of need for it. Right now, the straight line speed of an SSD, especially a by4 NVMe SSD, is not really a bottleneck for anything. You're running at multiple gigabytes per second of throughput, which even device to device is pretty damn fast, right? And when you try to go from that device to anything outside of that system, you're talking about, wired networking, wireless networking, external storage, Thunderbolt, like all these interconnects now are going to be running slower probably than that NVMe SSD, so there's not a whole lot of demand for them to go faster yet. What Optane does is it tries to go faster at the low Q depth stuff, but to get the super high throughput numbers, you need to be at high Q depth stuff, which is, again, useful for straight line copies if you're moving some data from one drive to the other, mass data, video files, games, as you're moving back and forth between stuff, that would be beneficial. But I think for standard consumer work models or usage models, there's not really a need to go beyond where we're at yet. Not that I wouldn't be glad to see it. I'm always of that mindset of more. If you give people more performance, they will figure out a way to use it. That includes software developers as well. At Cryptic Hybrid wants to know, do you think there will be a Ryzen 2800X? And do you see AMD coming out with a Radeon RX 600 lineup this year? The Ryzen 2800X would be a Zen Plus part, the 2000 series chipset that AMD has already started with the 2400G and the 2200G. I guess you're referring to the fact that the leaks that have come out have only showed a 2700 and a 2600 kind of family of parts. Whether or not there'll be a 2800X, I honestly don't know. It would seem kind of crazy that there wouldn't be, because the 1800X was such a successful part, not in terms of sales necessarily compared to the rest of the lineup, but that it was, a flagpole in the ground, if you will, against the Intel solutions. So I do think that it would make sense to have a 2800X. Maybe it is coming out with these parts and all the leaks were wrong. I don't know. Or maybe it's a later part, but I don't know. I assume we'll see something with that name on it eventually. What it will be, I don't know. As for the Radeon RX 600 lineup, again, I don't really know. The public roadmaps that AMD gave out at CES didn't indicate that there was any kind of RX 600. As for what that product would it be a HBM-based product? Would it be a Polaris update? Would it be a Vega using a different memory controller? It's really complicated to think about, because AMD did put a significant amount of weight behind HBM interfaces, and we have not seen memory prices come down at all in basically any type of memory, whether it be flash or system memory or graphics memory at all. So I don't know about that either. It doesn't seem likely. We haven't seen any kind of rumors of that leaking out, but it's possible that maybe in October, November, we get some kind of magic surprise from AMD in that regard. Let's see. At Kellerman asks, are we ever going to get a straight answer about the GeForce Partner Program? If you guys haven't read about this, Hard OCP did a really good write-up on what the GeForce Partner Program was and the potential conflicts it creates and potential, anti-competitive stuff that it does just in terms of de-incentivizing partners from using Radeon hardware in their lineup as well. I'm not going to get into it here. We talked about it on this week's podcast, which you can listen to, or you can go read Kyle's story if you want to talk about it. As for will you ever get a straight answer about it, I assume what Kellerman is asking is not a straight answer from me or Kyle or anybody else in the media, because we can't provide the straight answers because we don't know for sure all the answers. But if the question is, will you get one out of NVIDIA, I don't think it's likely, right? NVIDIA is they're very secretive company. They do things their own reasons for marketing, publicity, product design, whatever it is. They're going to stick to the company line that they've put out there, and it's up to everybody else to do their research or some other partner to come out and talk about it, either positively or negatively, and kind of help set the record straight. But I don't imagine you're going to see a blog tomorrow from Jensen suddenly saying, "Oh, here's all the information you wanted to know about the GeForce Partner Program." It's just not going to happen. All right, our last question in this not shortened episode of the mailbag comes from Mr. KZ Demos. Wants to know, when will Josh legally change his name to Walrus? We've been pitching it for a while, and we will check in on it as soon as we can. Thanks everybody for listening, or for watching, I guess too. If you have a question, leave it in the YouTube video comments on the YouTube page or at PCPer.com, wherever this video is posted. We'll read those comments and supply some questions for next week. I'll probably be out next week, so we might have Alan on or we might have Josh on. So if you have questions specifically pertaining to one of those two guys, let me know, or just post that in the comments with it, and we'll organize and sort accordingly. So thanks everybody. We'll see you next week, and root on the Kentucky Wildcats for me. I'd appreciate it. Bye guys.